Hi, welcome to Cannabis Science's virtual event series. My name is Ruth Fisher, and I'll be speaking to you about the research on cannabis for arthritis. Let me start by giving just a very brief background on me. I'm an economist, a systems modeler. I came to cannabis in about 2016 to help my brother figure out how to use cannabis to help his MS-induced neuropathic pain. And I fell down the cannabis rabbit hole at that point. Haven't stopped reading since then. I've been heavily involved in doing research on medical cannabis. My brother and I created Can Dynamics. We founded Can Dynamics to create a technology and education surrounding cannabis. And I've also been doing a lot of research on market dynamics, understanding how the regulations are affecting the rollout and how well the current markets are serving the different participants, the growers, the processors, the dispensers, and especially the patients and users. So that's kind of my background in cannabis. So as I said, I'll be discussing the research on cannabis for arthritis. So let's get going. First, let's get a general understanding about what arthritis is. But before I do that, let me take a step back and say the information that I'm presenting you here today is all taken from an article that I wrote for Cannabis Patient Care magazine on the overview of the research for cannabis for arthritis. And that will be published in their March-April issue. So again, Cannabis Patient Care magazine. And all the references for the information I'm providing here today can be found in that article. So now let's just get a brief overview of what arthritis is. It's a condition that affects the joints, and it causes pain, swelling, and stiffness. It's the leading cause of disability in adults, and it affects almost a quarter of the adult population here in the US. The primary or most common form of arthritis is osteoarthritis, and that involves wear and tear of the cartilage, which is the protective covering on the bones, and the wear and tear of the cartilage causes the bones to grind up against one another. The osteoarthritis is more commonly found in women, in people with a genetic predisposition towards osteoarthritis, in people who are older or who have suffered some sort of joint injury, or people who are overweight, because being overweight puts extra wear and tear and pressure on the bones. There are currently a couple of different types of therapeutics available to treat arthritis, specifically NSAIDs and opioids. But unfortunately, both of these types of therapeutics have problems with long-term use. The second most common form of arthritis is rheumatoid arthritis, and that involves inflamed and swollen synovial membranes, which is the membrane that surrounds all the joint tissues. And this swelling and inflammation can cause cartilage and bone damage. Rheumatoid arthritis is an autoimmune disease, and so it's caused by a combination of genetic predisposition, environmental factors, and also dysregulated immune system. There are 4 different classes of therapeutics available to treat rheumatoid arthritis. However, as with the therapeutics for osteoarthritis, the various therapeutics available do have problems associated with long-term use. So what we know then is arthritis is a very common problem. And while there currently are available therapeutics, patients could definitely benefit from having alternatives to the currently available therapeutics, especially therapeutics that would be less harmful for chronic use, as in the case of arthritis patients. So now, before I progress on to describing the different mechanisms of action for how cannabis can be used to treat arthritis, I'd like to review a couple of different body processes that will be important for understanding how cannabis can be used to treat the symptoms of arthritis. So we'll start with the pain signal processing, that process. And pain signal processing, again, as a very quick and dirty overview, what that involves is you get a stimulus to your tissue. And in this case, suppose you cut your finger. And what happens is the sensory neurons that are near where you get that stimulus, those neurons will send signals to the brain, and the brain will receive the signals. It will process them and interpret them as being pain. It will then send those now interpreted pain signals back down to the joint tissue where your finger begins to ache or throb. So that's kind of the pathways for the pain signal processing. The other process I'd like to just really quickly discuss is inflammation. So in inflammation, again, suppose you have a stimulus to your cell tissues there. Your immune system responds to that stimulus by flooding the area with immune system cells. And what the immune system cells do is they attack and kill the stimulus. They clean out the area and they restore it to normal functioning. However, when you have that flood of activity into the area, that can cause collateral damage to nearby healthy cells. So you're essentially kind of exacerbating the original problem of the stimulus by killing unnecessarily or damaging unnecessarily healthy neighboring cells. And this potential for damage associated with excess immune system activity is going to be greater when you have a chronic inflammation like you have with arthritis. So now let's move on to understanding the different mechanisms of action for how cannabis can actually treat symptoms of arthritis. Researchers have discovered 4 different main mechanisms of action. The first involves modulating joint functioning through your endocannabinoid system. So researchers have discovered that there are cannabinoid receptors in all different sorts of joint tissues. And they've looked at taken biopsies of patients with arthritis, and they've noticed that in arthritis patients, the number of endocannabinoid receptors, the cannabinoid receptors there, and the amount of endocannabinoid activity is all elevated. So what this means is that your ECS system, your endocannabinoid system, is responsible for modulating and addressing problems with arthritis or joint problems more generally. And that in people who have arthritis, your endocannabinoid system is already there trying to moderate or treat the symptoms associated with arthritis. So in this case, you can use cannabis to simply bolster your system's own natural defense mechanisms for treating the symptoms of arthritis. The second mechanism for using cannabis to treat arthritis involves inflammation and pain signaling, as we just discussed. So first, if we look at the inflammation system, you have cannabinoid receptors in your cell tissues. And so cannabis can be used when you have inflammation to act on the receptors there in the cells to essentially stem or mitigate the inflammatory response from your immune system. So you're decreasing the flow of cells into the area, you're decreasing the amount of inflammation, and you're also decreasing the potential for collateral damage to healthy cells and tissues surrounding that arthritis activity. Now, at the same time, cannabis can be used in the pain signaling process. So you have in the area of the arthritis in the joint cells, you have the neurons there and you have cannabinoid receptors there. And what those cannabinoid receptors can do is prevent those neurons from sending signals to the brain to be processed as pain. Now, once the signals have received those messages from the tissue activity and the joint tissue activity to be processed as pain, you also have cannabinoid receptors in the brain, and cannabis can act on those receptors in the brain to prevent them from interpreting the signals as being pain related. So now the third mechanism of action that cannabis can be used for to treat arthritis involves the arthritis-induced comorbidities. And in particular, people with arthritis, they tend to have problems with insomnia, and they have problems with arthritis with anxiety and depression. And so cannabis can be used to help treat or address these comorbidities, both directly and indirectly. So we have cannabinoid receptors in the brain, and we can use cannabis to activate those receptors in the brain to directly reduce insomnia, anxiety, and depression associated with arthritis. Now, at the same time, we can also address those comorbidities indirectly by, again, this is like the second mechanism, by reducing the inflammation and the pain associated with the inflammation in arthritis activity. By reducing the arthritis symptoms there, will then reduce the comorbidities, the insomnia, anxiety, and depression induced by the inflammation and pain. Now, the fourth mechanism of action involves, similar to number one, where you're working on your own body's endocannabinoid system to decrease the enzymes available that are breaking down your body's own natural endocannabinoids. So essentially, again, you're bolstering your own body's ability to naturally use the endocannabinoid system to fight off symptoms of arthritis. So now, researchers have discovered two potential problems with using cannabis to treat arthritis. The first problem is the well-known problem that when we use cannabis, it activates receptors in the brain, which causes psychoactivity. And patients who are using cannabis to treat arthritis, a lot of them aren't interested in experiencing those psychoactive effects. So in response to that, researchers have been trying to avoid the THC-induced psychoactivity by administering cannabis outside of the central nervous system. Now, unfortunately, THC acting on CB1 receptors have caused pro-inflammatory cardiovascular and metabolic side effects. So that's obviously a problem, causing inflammation. So in response to that, researchers have tried to use different types of natural and synthetic forms of cannabinoids as receptor antagonists, in other words, to turn off the pro-inflammatory mechanisms. But unfortunately, administering CB1 receptor antagonists has been shown to cause unfavorable psychiatric effects in patients. So that's obviously a real problem. So we do have these two issues here, the psychoactivity and the pro-inflammatory effects of cannabis. The problems haven't been solved, but research is ongoing in both of these areas. Now, the next step I would normally take would be to look at any clinical studies done to see what researchers are finding in terms of actually using cannabis to treat patients with arthritis using cannabis, to see how well cannabis is doing in actually treating patients' arthritis. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of studies, clinical studies done using cannabis to treat arthritis, and there aren't any randomized control trials, which are the gold standard for considering how effective cannabis is in actually treating patients with arthritis. Fortunately, however, there are a lot of surveys that have been done of cannabis patients who are using cannabis to treat arthritis. So we can look at those surveys to understand which patients are choosing to use cannabis to treat their arthritis and what types of effects they're getting. So I found 3 different sets of studies that I would now like to take you through. So the first set of surveys involved medical cannabis dispensary patients. So they're going into medical cannabis dispensaries and surveying patients there. So these are people who are obviously using cannabis therapeutically. And they're asking them, what they're using their cannabis to treat and how well cannabis is working to treat those symptoms. So there were 3 studies done, one in Canada, one in Arizona, and one in Los Angeles. Now, again, keep in mind, we're looking at patients in dispensaries, and the survey respondents of dispensary patients were predominantly white males, and they tended to have higher levels of income and education. Now, I know that a lot of dispensary patients are using cannabis patients are using cannabis to treat pain. I guess since arthritis is so predominant, it shouldn't be surprising, but I was surprised that roughly 15 to 25% of cannabis dispensary patients, medical cannabis users, are using cannabis to treat arthritis. I was surprised at how high that number was. But I guess in retrospect, now that I know more about arthritis, it's not so surprising. In the Canadian study, the patients who reported using cannabis to treat arthritis said they reported that they're using the cannabis to treat specific symptoms, including sleep, pain, inflammation, anxiety, and depression. And interestingly, most of the medical patients who are using cannabis therapeutically said that before they had started using cannabis therapeutically, they had initially been using cannabis recreationally. Now, that's a finding that comes up regularly, that the earlier patients who are using medical cannabis tend to be patients who had already had experience with cannabis using it recreationally. So that's, an interesting way of getting people into the cannabis world. These are already people familiar with cannabis, and I guess more likely then to switch from recreational use to also using it therapeutically. In Arizona, the survey respondents, again, who said that they were specifically using cannabis to treat arthritis, they reported that using cannabis gave them relief from their symptoms from arthritis. They reported that cannabis did better than their other medications at treating their symptoms from arthritis. And they also reported that a lot of them had used less of their other medications in favor more of using cannabis to treat their symptoms from arthritis. Now, the second set of studies involved two different online surveys. The first is an online survey done in the US of CBD patients, and this was a convenient sample, which is important to understand. The second survey is a survey done in Europe, and I want to get the source here, the Annual European Congress of Rheumatology. So it's a rheumatology conference, and they have a survey of arthritis patients, asking them if they've used cannabis. Now, online surveys asking patients, have you ever used cannabis? The respondents are much more likely to be biased in their nature. So especially the US survey is a convenient sample. Convenient samples are notoriously biased. But in general, if patients are asked to participate in a survey involving cannabis for arthritis, if arthritis patients haven't been using cannabis, then they're much more likely to refuse to participate or decline to participate. So that's something to keep in mind when we go through these results. Interestingly, as compared to the dispensary patients who are predominantly male, now we know that men tend to have an easier time going into dispensaries, cannabis dispensaries. Women and older people are much more reluctant, generally speaking, than young men are to go into cannabis dispensaries. So in these online surveys, the respondents are overwhelmingly female, and they have really high numbers of them have reported using cannabis, over about 70% in the US survey and over 50% in the European survey. And those are just really high numbers for arthritis patients who've reported using cannabis to treat their symptoms from arthritis. Now, interestingly, the vast majority reported that their symptoms improved. In the US, the patients, like in the previous surveys, reported reducing their other medications in favor of using cannabis to treat their arthritis. And notably, a significant number of people who are using cannabis to treat their arthritis are not telling their doctors that they're using cannabis in their healthcare treatments. And that's something that we'll come back to later, but that's definitely another significant finding. So now the last set of surveys I'd like to discuss, I thought were really, really interesting. You have a rheumatoid clinic, And you have researchers there in 2014 wanted to try and understand how many of their rheumatoid, their arthritis patients were using cannabis to treat their arthritis. And they also wanted to get an understanding of how the patients who chose to use cannabis to treat their arthritis differed from patients who didn't use cannabis to treat their arthritis. So they did this in 2014. And then 5 years later, in 2019, they repeated the study. So by having these two studies together, we can do some really interesting comparisons. And we can understand, first of all, how many people are using cannabis to treat their arthritis. But we can look at what users look like relative to non-users. And we can also look at how the characteristics of users are changing over time. So let's start with the first piece there. How many arthritis patients, when we just go into an arthritis clinic, how many patients are using cannabis to treat their arthritis? And notice these numbers, 4% and 8%, are much less than, if we go back to this previous survey, 70% and greater than 50% have reported using cannabis. In this rheumatoid clinic, only 4% had reported using cannabis therapeutically in 2014, and that doubled to over 8% 5 years later. And then if we look at the number of patients who continue to use cannabis to treat their arthritis, those numbers also doubled from about 3% to over 6% in 2019. And as we saw before, a lot of these therapeutic patients are also using cannabis recreationally. So now if we move on, let's look first at how cannabis users differ from non-users. And so the users here in the graph are the green bars, and the non-users are the yellow or gold bars, however you interpret that color. So in our first pass through this graph, we're going to look at how cannabis users compare to non-users. We're comparing the dark green bars to the yellow bars. So we see that the cannabis users relative to the non-users tended to be less female, meaning more male. They tend to be have a much higher incidence of being unemployed or disabled. In other words, they have more severe symptoms associated with their arthritis. They tend to be less likely to be osteoarthritis patients and less likely to be rheumatoid arthritis patients and slightly more likely to be osteoarthritis patients. They have a higher incidence of opioid use, which would be consistent with their greater severity of symptoms. And they have much greater incidence of past cigarette smoking and using cannabis recreationally. So what we're seeing here is the people who use cannabis relative to the non-users tend to be more male, have more significant symptoms, and are more marginal in terms of with respect to the rest of the population, in terms of or in the sense that they tend to be cigarette users and recreational cannabis users. So now if we look at how cannabis users have changed over time, now we're looking at how what the differences are between the dark green bars and the light green bars. So we see over time, the cannabis users the therapeutic users tend to be more female. They tend to be less unemployed. In other words, their symptoms are less intense than the earlier patients. They tend to have a relatively higher incidence of rheumatoid arthritis and lower incidence of osteoarthritis. They tend to be much less prone to using opioids, and that would be consistent with the lower unemployment, meaning they have less intense symptoms of arthritis. And they tend to be drastically less past cigarette users or recreational cannabis users. So in other words, what we're seeing is that over time, the people who are using cannabis to treat their arthritis, the patients have less severe symptoms, and they tend to be more mainstream users. In other words, what this is saying is that cannabis seems to become increasingly accepted by more mainstream society. Now, this is exactly what we would expect, but it's very refreshing to see it being actually played out in the data. Now, one last thing I'd like to cover before we end are a couple of the concerns that the researchers had who were doing all these different surveys, the concerns they had about the patients who are using cannabis to treat their arthritis. So the first concern was by the researchers were that patients were getting their cannabis from non-medical routes. And the concern here is the cannabis that they're using might be potentially unsafe or untested. The second concern that researchers expressed were that patients were smoking cannabis, and we know that smoking tobacco has been shown to be unhealthy. And the last concern is that many patients who are using cannabis to treat their arthritis are not discussing their cannabis use with their doctors. And of course, this is a problem because the doctors are then not able to, accommodate that cannabis use and make sure that it's being incorporated into their total kind of healthcare regimen, and make sure that their total healthcare regimen is consistent with using cannabis. There's no medication interactions or other potential problems. Well, that's all I have for you. I hope you found my talk useful, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you very much for listening.